just as well known to our audience, I know you've been a guest on Hour 25 a number of times, Karen, is Karen Wilson, who's a writer and singer, and she has a degree in Tudor history from UCLA. Is that
history.
Right? In history.
Emphasis in Tudor history, Renaissance, England,
right.
women.
And you've written for television. You wrote for Twilight Zone and many. Do you have any idea how many animated episodes?
Probably enough to kill a forest.
It's true. A forest of eyeballs,
yes.
young impressionable eyeballs. And so what we're going to do, we're all writers here, and I guess I have a couple of theses. One is that in general, writing about human beings is very interesting. Writing about men and women gets tricky. Okay, and the problem is that quite often, if you have a male character or a female character, the temptation is to write about them more as being men and women than about them as being human beings. Unless you're talking specifically about the reproductive roles, I haven't seen a whole lot of difference between men and women. There is only one major difference that I often see in terms of thought processes, and that is that men seem to talk about information separated from emotional context. They'll talk about the information first and the emotional stuff connected with it second. And I have noticed that women will tend to talk about the emotional stuff surrounding a fact before they'll actually talk about the fact. But that's virtually only real difference that I have seen, that I have run into repeatedly about it.
Well, there are a lot of cultural differences in how we're, I guess, indoctrinated, really is the word, when we're being raised, that have to do with like how the two sexes communicate different. I mean, I've read a few books on it, and that's, because my wife says, we don't communicate well enough. Here, read this book. This will help. And so it's like,
why don't you understand me? Books like that.
Well, yeah, exactly. And, it would be like, and then after a while, after we would try to, use the axioms in this book to try to communicate better, both of us will say, well, you didn't read the book right because you didn't understand what they were saying, that they were there. So, but there are definite cultural differences. A lot of it does have to do with, how you process information, or the male role as problem solver. Because we're indoctrinated to be able to solve problems.
So your feeling is that the primary differences are cultural?
Yeah.
Okay. Karen?
Yeah.
I just have a problem with something that you said.
Good. I don't understand you.
You're flat. I don't understand you either, Arthur. Where are the bumps in your life?
That's right, yes.
I think that a lot of science fiction has to do with roles of authority. People portray themselves as adventurers and
Captain Kirk,
right, and that kind of thing. And traditionally, authority figures will speak fact first and emotion later. And I think that that's something in our society now that is changing. Because if you look at the last election, a lot of Clinton's emphasis was on the emotional portion of the issue first and then present the facts.
I have noticed that tendency in more and more politics. Actually.
And I think that that's something that's going to creep into our literature and has been creeping into our literature. An example, a very stupid example, because they try hard to put some emotion into animated characters like Batman, the new series. And if you notice, Batman is thinking a lot about his past and about what motivates him, what drives him, what pushes him, what he's after, and the criminal is almost a secondary part of the package. He's on a personal quest for himself, and that is a different kind of a male figure that we're seeing that we haven't seen on television before.
For like Batman, yeah, but they are also overemphasized. I mean, like if there was a Batman in real life, just like if there was a Sherlock Holmes in real life, he would not be constantly ruminating over what drives him to be who he is. So I think in a lot of ways, it's
now,
sort of
why
like
not?
Because
our great leaders in history, take Napoleon, for example, were wonderful ruminators. They're worried constantly about the emotional side, about the impact and effect that they had. And sometimes even in their battle plans, their facts came second rather than first.
Well, do you always worry about your primary motivations, like something that happened to you in the crib when you were a year and a half old?
I absolutely do. Constantly.
You're just not an introspective type.
I know, I guess not.
Somebody put an ice pick up your nose and wiggled it around in your forebrain a few times when you were a kid. That'll pacify the little bastard.
No wonder nobody understands you.
I mean, the most interesting leader is someone who challenges their basic assumptions about themselves, their world, the people that they meet, whether they're male or female. And if you go through life, you don't challenge why your frame is the way it is, then how can you build something with it?
Well, I'm not disputing that, and actually.
What are you disputing then, Arthur?
Well, actually, in one case, what I was disputing was the fact that, if we were talking about characterization and animation, was the fact that I do not think that a character such as Bruce Wayne or Batman, who knows very well who he is, would constantly be ruminating over it, that it would be much easier for him to accept his identity because he's been doing it for so long.
Okay, let me interject a
And
comment.
so a lot of ways what they're doing is artifice.
Let me interject a thought here. I've only seen 2 episodes
I've seen about 4 or 5
of it through the auspices of Michael Reeves, and I liked what it was that I saw. I don't know how or when he's doing the ruminating, but one difference I have seen between male and female writers as a stereotypical thing. Once again, male writers will have men go through scenes of incredible violence and have no emotional reaction to it. Women writers will have characters emoting during action scenes. Both are absurd.
Oh yeah, I would
But
agree.
they're absurd in different directions. One of the
But Steve,
reasons
I
why
wonder-
Sue Grafton's books of Kinsey Millhone appeal to me so much is I was reading this thing and there is a chase scene in a car, and I was saying yeah, and I suddenly realized that I had never read a woman writer writing an action scene without talking about how people feel in the middle of it. That was the first time I'd seen that. It was like, wow.
I think that's part of the Western tradition of literature, though, Steve.
To
I
what?
think- To consider the action and then go on to the next action, rather than the pause in between for that breath to think about what happened. And I think that several writers, including yourself, by the way, break that mold, and that's why they're quite popular. Ursula K. Le Guin's male characterizations are very full and very rich because they stop. They go through the action scenes and then they stopped either before or sometimes during to get a thought in there.
There's action in Ursula's writing.
Actually, there's quite a bit of action, I think.
I would say.
And Barbara Hamley does the same thing with her male
Yes,
characters.
it could very, there might be many other women who do this. All I'm saying is that I consider this to be good, just as I enjoy male characters who stop and feel after they've killed somebody. So, I mean, like James Bond actually emoted after he killed somebody in one of the early books. You'd never see him in the movies doing that, you know.
No.
But to go through a life-threatening situation and not feel afterwards is as absurd as feeling in the middle of an action. Okay, both of these things, it doesn't happen that way. And anyone who's actually been in such
you're saying
circumstances
that, like,
understands this.
that men and women and
Exaggerate in
writers,
different directions.
Yeah, but they tend to solve what I would actually consider to be like a technical problem in different ways. It's
It
like
could
where
be.
you put like the emotion.
It could be. Now, one
Emotion
thing
of it.
concerning Ursula Le Guin is that in Left Hand of Darkness, I thought that her male character in that was an absurdity. She created a male character who had zero male sex drive. He was completely atypical as a
Well,
male.
I can see why that would be difficult for you to understand, Steve. But there are men out there who
Yes.
are not like you.
That's right, but that is not, the average male could not even come close to going a year on a planet without thinking about sex. That's just, and if he had been chosen for if that was the case, the human race would not exist, okay? That has nothing to do with probably 9/10 of the men. If this character had been chosen specifically because he had a low sex drive, or if he was taking something to lower it as an ambassador, which was a clear possibility, that's fine. But I don't think that it even occurred to Ursula that this would be abnormal. I don't know what men she's been hanging around with.
So it bothered you that the
I don't know,
question
I
didn't
think that
get
her-
Yeah,
addressed.
it's
Right,
the
yeah.
most important reason why it bothered me was because the book was specifically about the difference in sexuality between this species and human beings. But the human representative had no sex drive at all. It became an absurd exercise. Now, let me also say that I thought the book was far better than my own writing at this point. I'm not trying to say I could have done it better.
Well, I think you just raised a very important point that comes to the heart of what we're talking about. And that is the assumption that the reader brings about what defines a male or a female character. And even though an author may think differently about what men and women are like and how they think like,
yeah.
if you don't address the questions that your reader has,
Yeah.
then you have not created a full character.
Well,
for
one of the
them.
reasons why it occurred to me is that one of her points seemed to be that because human beings are obsessed with sexuality and men are obsessed with sex towards women, that this other culture where they cycled through being male and female was in many ways a more balanced culture. But since she had created this is specifically in reaction to what she perceived as being a pervasive sexuality in human culture, then having a human representative who was asexual, that seemed a very odd thing.
Well, I haven't read the book since it came out, which was like 68 or 69,
Mhm.
but my memory of it is that it's a very intellectual, literary
Yes.
take on it, and I don't think,
It's
and it was
beautifully
not,
written.
it was not about the heat of sex. I mean, it was just not the tack that she was taking on the subject matter.
There was one scene where the person who was male at one point, who he's going across the ice with, and there's this wonderfully written scene, and his companion sort of goes through heat as he's sort of changing genders, and there's a moment where this other character is like going through this. So it does deal with it a few times, but my feeling is that the complaint that women often have, and I think justifiably so, is that men often create two-dimensional female characters. Men, I think, can justifiably say that women often create male characters that have very little resemblance to what men are. I believe that men and women know about equal amounts about each other, which is maybe not a whole lot.
Very two-dimensional.
And maybe quite a bit. So one of the things I wanted to see is where does this come together? And I wanted to get a comment from Sandy on this subject before we went on.
Yeah, well, I have something else to add.
Yes, after.
Oh, okay. Yes. Oh, on this?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm finding things getting a little bit better. I just read my first V.I. Warshawski book.
I'm reading one now. Yeah.
And I think she does a wonderful job of a female character that is in a male role and dealing with violence and getting beat up and fighting. She knows some karate or whatever it is. And it's like you said, when she's in there and she's fighting, that's what she's concentrating on, that's what you're reading, and then afterwards she thinks about it.
Good.
Yes.
Good.
So I'm very, very pleased.
Mike Hammer could blow away a whole house full of people and not lose a beat. And that's a complete and utter absurdity.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen like that. That is a male fantasy. And it's a pretty shallow two-dimensional one, too. But how should we? Like I said, there's this thing called a human being. And then there is this 1 or 2% difference, I think, over here that says male. It's a little sliver of pure maleness, and over here it has this little sliver of pure femaleness. How do we think? Yeah. What are the differences between men and women that have been portrayed in science fiction books and film up until this point? And when we get shed of that, then we can talk about how we can approach it, how we would like to approach it from here on out.
Well, the first thing I wanted to notice was the need for shorthand in both films and television and books. And shorthand means stereotyped behavior. What I like about more modern science fiction is the fact that some of the Jungian ideas in psychology, the idea of the animus and the anima, the male and female spirit inside of every human being to be balanced, which is a very Eastern idea. I think that that's starting to come out in our literature, and I think authors have to be aware of that side of themselves. They have to use their creative juices to be a mirror, to hold it up to themselves and say, what about me is not stereotypical? What about me is male or female, and how would I characterize that? How do they blend together? How do they fight each other? Because if you don't understand that in yourself, how can you portray that on paper? Or how can you convince someone outside of yourself that that's a particular role that you are creating?
Art?
Well, I would agree in a way. I need to go back to Left Hand of Darkness because it's, the observation I want to make about it is not, or is somewhat germane to what you're saying, because the notion of sex in Left Hand of Darkness is what I would call, it's a very literary, almost reactionary view about sex, because in certain forms of mainstream literature, and I mean like high-class academic stuff that most of us were forced to read, a person's sexuality actually sheds him or her of his or her humanity. And so the reason why the protagonist of Left Hand of Darkness doesn't seem to have that much of a sex drive is because Ursula, as an artist, is not interested in what makes that person an animal from that literary
Yeah,
point of view.
I think that she's
now Ursula as a woman did not really impress me as the type who ever really had that problem, because an artist is only the reflection of the mind, and it's a reflection of of her intellect.